It was the time when Israel sank into the deepest darkness. Once again the people had broken their sacred covenant with the Lord, and his judgment did not fall from the sky but rose from the sea. God handed them over to the Philistines, ruthless warriors who carried a terrible secret that made them invincible, the mastery of iron. While Israel fought with simple tools, their enemies forged equipment that was far more advanced and overwhelming. For 40 long years, the tribes groaned under the weight of slavery and humiliation, but God did not abandon his people. In a forgotten village, he was preparing a weapon of his own. From a barren womb would come a man of fire and fury, destined to overcome lions and bring down strongholds with his bare hands. This is the tragic and powerful story of Samson, the breaker of chains. Before we witness the rise of the strongest man in history, please support our channel by clicking the like button to help this message reach more souls. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey through the scriptures. Now, let us return to the ancient days of the Judges. The history of Israel during the era of the Judges was not written in ink, but in the dust of dry fields and the silence of a people who had lost their way. It was a time when the nation sank into darkness, for once again, the people had broken their ancient covenant with the Lord, and judgment did not fall from the sky, but rose from the sea. God handed them over to the Philistines, a warrior people notorious for their ferocity and military discipline. The Philistines were not merely stronger, they possessed a terrible secret that the Israelites did not understand. They had mastered the art of iron. While the men of Israel still fought with soft bronze weapons that bent and dulled in the heat of battle, the Philistines forged swords and spears that were harder, sharper, and deadlier. This technological gap created an age of despair. The ruthless Philistines captured the children of Abraham, plundered their harvests, and for 40 long years, they humiliated and enslaved the people of Israel. Fear became the daily bread of the tribes. Patrols of Philistine soldiers would march through the valleys, their iron armor glinting in the harsh sun, a constant reminder that resistance was futile. But God, in his infinite mystery, did not abandon his people, even when they had abandoned him. He was preparing an answer, not in a war room or a palace, but in a forgotten village belonging to the tribe of Dan. In this village lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They were a simple couple, faithful amidst a faithless generation, yet they carried a deep and private sorrow. They could not have children. In those ancient days, infertility was not just a medical condition, it was seen as a disgrace, a sign that one's life was incomplete and perhaps even cursed. The woman's empty womb mirrored the state of her nation. Israel, the chosen people, was also without hope, a fruitless nation, oppressed by enemies, and unable to bring forth its own deliverance. One afternoon, while the woman was alone in the field, away from the prying eyes of her neighbors, the silence of the day was shattered by a presence that was not of this world. A brilliant light surrounded her. An angel of the Lord appeared, standing amidst the dry wheat, and spoke words that would alter the course of history. The visitor spoke with authority. "You are barren and childless," the angel said, acknowledging her deepest pain, "but you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." The woman stood frozen, her heart racing. The message continued with specific, strict instructions. "Now be careful," the angel urged. "Drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean." This was no ordinary child. The angel declared that the boy's head must never be touched by a razor, for he was to be a Nazirite to God from birth. To be a Nazirite was a sacred and heavy calling, a total consecration to the divine. And then came the promise that defined his destiny. He will begin to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Trembling with emotion, the woman ran to find her husband. She told Manoah that a man of God had come to her, looking like an angel, terrible and majestic. Manoah, filled with wonder and a healthy fear, prayed to the Lord. He asked God to send the man back so they could fully understand how to raise such a special child. God heard Manoah's voice. The angel appeared again to the woman as she sat in the field. She ran to fetch her husband, and Manoah followed her to the stranger. When Manoah asked if he was the one who had spoken to his wife, the angel simply replied, "I am." The instructions were repeated. The child was to be set apart. He must never touch the fruit of the vine, never eat anything forbidden, and never cut his hair. These were the boundaries of his power, the conditions of the covenant that would turn a boy into a weapon of God. Manoah stood before the mysterious visitor, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. for he was still unsure if he was speaking to a prophet of Israel or a divine being from the heavens. The weight of the prophecy hung heavy in the air, mixing with the dust and the heat of the day, and in his confusion, he wished to cling to the ancient laws of hospitality. He spoke with a trembling voice, offering to prepare a young goat for the visitor to eat, hoping that a shared meal might bridge the terrifying gap between the mortal and the divine. But the angel of the Lord raised a hand in refusal, his presence commanding a silence that seemed to stop the wind itself. He told Manoah that he would not eat of his food, but if Manoah wished to make an offering, he must offer it as a burnt sacrifice solely to the Lord. The refusal was not out of rudeness, but out of holiness, a reminder that the visitor was sustained by a power that men could not comprehend. Manoah obeyed, though his hands shook as he prepared the young goat and the grain offering. He selected a flat rock that jutted out of the earth like a natural altar, a rugged stone that would soon become holy ground. He laid the offering upon the cold surface and struck flint to create a spark. As the fire caught the dry wood and began to consume the sacrifice, something incredible and terrifying happened, shattering the laws of nature. The flames did not merely burn, they danced and roared with a color that was brighter than the sun. As the fire leaped toward the sky in a pillar of heat and light, the angel of the Lord did not walk away into the fields. Instead, he stepped into the heart of the fire. He ascended within the flame, rising upward toward the heavens, becoming one with the light until he vanished into the firmament, leaving only smoke and awe in his wake. Manoah and his wife fell to the ground, pressing their faces into the dust, overwhelmed by the raw power they had just witnessed. The silence that followed was deafening. The realization of what had occurred struck Manoah with the force of a physical blow, draining the color from his face. He whispered to his wife, his voice thick with terror, saying that they were going to die for sure because they had seen God. In his mind, the old belief that no man could look upon the divine and live was now a death sentence. He waited for the strike, for the judgment, for his life to be extinguished for having dared to look at the Holy One. But his wife possessed a wisdom and a spiritual clarity that calmed his rising panic. She did not tremble as he did. Instead, she looked at the lingering smoke with eyes full of faith. She placed a hand on his shoulder and answered him gently, her voice a soothing balm to his fear. She reasoned that if the Lord had truly wanted to end their lives, he would not have accepted the burnt offering from their hands. He would not have taken the time to show them these wonders or to deliver such a specific and hopeful promise about a son. Her logic was sound and anchored in truth. From her barrenness, which had been a source of deep sorrow, came the promise of life. In due time, the seasons turned, and the woman gave birth to a son just as it had been spoken. They named him Samson. The name was prophetic and heavy with meaning, for Samson means little son. In the midst of the dark oppression of the Philistines, where hope had been extinguished for 40 years, this child was destined to be the ray of light, announcing the dawn of liberation. From the earliest days of his childhood, it was clear to everyone in the village that Samson was not like the other children. He was set apart, not just by the long hair that flowed down his back in accordance with his vow, but by an aura of intensity that seemed to radiate from his very skin. He was not like the other boys in the camp of Dan, who played at war with sticks. He carried himself with a gravity that belonged to a much older man. As he grew, his body developed a density and power that seemed impossible for a human being. His muscles did not just grow, they seemed to be carved from the rock of the earth itself. But it was not just physical muscle that set him apart. It was the Spirit of God beginning to move in him, a supernatural force that surged through his veins like liquid fire. At times, in the camp between Zorah and Eshtal, a strange and overwhelming energy would come over him. It was a stirring that made his hands restless and his heart beat with the rhythm of a war drum. He would pace the edges of the camp, looking out toward the horizon where the Philistine garrison stood, feeling a pull that he could not yet fully understand. Yet, with this incredible strength came a much greater internal battle, a war waged within the silence of his own soul. Part of Samson wanted to obey the strict rules of his Nazirite vow and fulfill the holy purpose for which he was born. He knew he was chosen, and he knew he belonged to God. But another part of him, the human part, looked at the world with hungry eyes. He wanted to be a normal young man. He saw his peers feasting, drinking the fruit of the vine, and living without the heavy burden of destiny, and a deep seed of envy began to take root in his heart. He wanted to do whatever he pleased. to taste the freedoms that others enjoyed so carelessly. This struggle between obeying God and following his own impulsive desires would accompany him throughout his life, a shadow that trailed his every step. He felt the isolation of his calling keenly. He could not touch what others touched. He could not partake in the celebrations that defined the culture around him. By the time Samson became a young man, everyone in Israel knew of his strength, but they also knew of his temperament. He was unpredictable. He acted without thinking, letting himself be carried away by whatever emotion seized him in the moment. He was a volatile force, a storm waiting to break upon the world. The people of Dan looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, wondering if this wild and restless young man would be their savior, or if his fire would consume them all. The rebellion began with a journey. One day, Samson went down to the city of Timnah, a Philistine stronghold. Walking through the streets, surrounded by the enemies of his people, he saw a Philistine woman who captivated him. The Philistines were the oppressors who did not follow God's laws. A marriage with one of them was socially and spiritually forbidden. But Samson did not care about politics or religion. He saw her, and in that instant, he decided she had to be his. When he returned home, he demanded of his parents, "Get her for me as my wife." His parents were stunned and heartbroken. They pleaded with him, asking if there was not a single woman among the daughters of Israel that he had to go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife. They knew this union was dangerous and could lead him to break his covenant. But logic did not work with Samson. His answer was blunt and final, "Get her for me, for she pleases me well." To the outside world, this looked like the whim of a reckless young man. But what no one knew, not even his parents, was that this stubbornness was actually the first piece of God's plan. The Lord was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. Samson and his parents set out on the road to Timnah to arrange the marriage. At one point in the journey, Samson veered off the main path and ventured into the vineyards of Timnah. This was a dangerous place for a Nazirite. Surrounded by the grapes he was forbidden to taste. Suddenly, the silence of the vineyard shattered. A deep, blood-curdling roar echoed through the vines. From the thick undergrowth, a young lion leaped out. It was strong, hungry, and heading straight for him. Samson stood alone. He had no sword, no spear, and no shield. He was completely unarmed in the face of a beast designed to kill. But in that exact moment of mortal danger, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily. Supernatural strength flooded every fiber of his being, and fear vanished, replaced by overwhelming power. Samson did not run. He met the charge of the beast. He overpowered the beast with his bare hands, subduing it with a strength that defied explanation. The violence was sudden and absolute. The lion lay defeated at his feet, silenced by the force of God acting through a man. Samson stood over the carcass, breathing heavily, his hands stained with the evidence of the struggle. He told no one about what he had done, not even his father or mother. He kept the secret of his power hidden, just as he hid the darker impulses that were beginning to take root in his heart. This victory in the vineyard was only the beginning, a foreshadowing of the violence that would follow him all the days of his life. Some time passed after the incident in the vineyard, and the season for the marriage arrived. Samson prepared to return to the city of Timnah, to claim the woman who had captured his eyes. He walked the same dusty road as before, but this time he was not merely a restless young man. He was a man who carried a secret weight of supernatural power. The memory of the young lion was vivid in his mind, drawing him back to the place where life and death had collided in the shadows of the vines. Curiosity, that dangerous companion of the wise and the foolish alike, seized him. He turned aside from the main path to see what had become of the beast he had torn apart. The air in the vineyard was thick and sweet, not with the scent of grapes, but with a strange, humming vibration. As he approached the skeletal remains of the lion, he saw a sight that defied the natural order. The carcass, which should have been a rotting heap consumed by scavengers and decay, had become a vessel of life. A swarm of bees had taken residence within the ribcage of the dead beast. They had built a complex and golden hive within the hollow of the bones. It was a stark contradiction. Out of death had come sweetness. Samson looked at the honeycomb, glistening in the filtered sunlight. His stomach grumbled, and his desire for the honey overwhelmed his spiritual discipline. Without hesitation, he reached his hand into the carcass. He scooped out the honeycomb, ignoring the fact that he was touching a dead body. By doing this, Samson violated the laws of his Nazirite vow, which strictly forbade contact with any corpse or carcass. Yet, he felt no immediate thunderbolt from heaven. He ate the honey as he walked, enjoying the rich sweetness that melted on his tongue. It was a symbol of his growing arrogance. He believed his strength made him immune to the rules that governed ordinary men. When he rejoined his father and mother on the road, he offered them some of the honey. They ate it, unaware of its source. Samson said nothing to them. He kept the origin of the food a secret, for he knew his parents would be horrified that their holy son had defiled himself with the dead. This secret became a seed of pride in his heart, a belief that he could walk through the valley of sin and emerge untouched. They arrived in Timnah, and the preparations for the wedding began. In the culture of the Philistines, a wedding was not a brief ceremony but a marathon of celebration, a feast that lasted for 7 full days. Samson, adhering to the custom of the land, hosted a banquet. However, the atmosphere was not one of pure joy. The Philistines, suspicious of this powerful Israelite who walked with the confidence of a king, did not trust him. They appointed 30 young men to be his companions. Ostensibly, these men were guests of honor and groomsmen, but in reality, they were guards assigned to watch him, ensuring that this dangerous stranger caused no trouble within their walls. The air in the banquet hall was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and the sound of Philistine music. Samson sat at the head of the table, observing the 30 men who watched him with cold, calculating eyes. He felt a surge of intellectual superiority. He possessed a strength they could not match, and now he wanted to prove he possessed a wit they could not defeat. He decided to humiliate them with a riddle, a common form of entertainment that was also a battle of minds. Samson stood up, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the table. He spoke with a booming voice that silenced the room. "Let me pose a riddle to you," he announced. "If you can solve it within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot solve it, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing." The stakes were incredibly high. In the ancient world, fine clothing was a form of wealth, equivalent to a small fortune. To lose such a wager would be financially devastating and socially humiliating for the 30 companions. Confident in their collective intelligence, they accepted the challenge. Samson smiled, thinking of the lion and the honey, a secret known only to him and the God of heaven. He recited his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. The 30 Philistines leaned in, their brows furrowed. They whispered among themselves, analyzing every word. They thought of predators, of harvests, of mythical beasts. But as the first day turned into the second, and the second into the third, their confidence turned to anxiety. The riddle was a locked door for which they had no key. It was not based on general knowledge but on a specific, private experience of Samson. By the middle of the week, the festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a tense and sweating desperation. They realized that Samson intended to strip them of their wealth and send them home in shame. As the sun set on the 3rd day and rose on the 4th, the 30 companions realized they were trapped. They could not solve the riddle, and they could not afford the price of failure. Their embarrassment turned into malice. They were warriors and sons of conquerors. They would not be bested by a Hebrew guest. They decided that if they could not defeat Samson with their minds, they would defeat him through the one person he trusted. They cornered Samson's wife while she was alone. Their voices, once full of wedding cheers, were now low and serpentine with threats. They did not ask for her help. They demanded it. "Entice your husband to explain the riddle to us," they hissed, "or we will bring ruin upon you and your father's house. Did you invite us here to rob us?" The threat was terrifyingly real. The Philistines were known for their brutality, and the woman knew they would not hesitate to burn her alive along with her family. Terror seized her heart. She was caught between a dangerous husband she barely knew and the ruthless men of her own city. She chose self-preservation. When Samson came to her, expecting affection, he found only tears. She wept uncontrollably, throwing herself upon him. She did not tell him of the threat. Instead, she used emotional manipulation, a weapon against which Samson had no defense. "You only hate me," she sobbed, burying her face in his chest. "You do not love me. You have given a riddle to my people, but you have not explained it to me." Samson was baffled. He tried to reason with her. He explained that he had not even told his own father or mother, the people who had raised him and kept his secret since birth. Why then should he tell her, a woman he had known for only a short time? But logic has no power over calculated grief. For the remaining days of the feast, she made his life miserable. Every moment they were together, she wept. She accused him of cruelty and lack of trust. Her tears wore him down like water dripping on a stone. Samson, who could tear a lion apart, found himself exhausted by the relentless sorrow of his bride. On the seventh day, unable to bear her weeping any longer, he told her the secret. He told her of the lion and the honey. Immediately, she dried her tears and ran to the 30 companions, delivering the answer that would save her life and destroy her husband's trust. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon on the seventh day, marking the end of the feast and the deadline for the wager. Samson sat with the 30 companions, a triumphant smile playing on his lips, believing he had won. But just before the sun vanished, the leader of the Philistines stood up. He looked at Samson with a smug, mocking expression and delivered the answer they had stolen. "What is sweeter than honey?" he asked, pausing for effect. "And what is stronger than a lion?" The room went silent. The blood drained from Samson's face, replaced instantly by a flush of dark, volcanic rage. He looked at his wife, who stood in the shadows, her eyes averted. He understood everything in a heartbeat. She had betrayed him. The intimacy of their marriage had been sold to the enemy. Samson glared at the men and spoke a proverb that dripped with contempt. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." He compared them to farmers using his animal to do their work, a crude insult that showed his utter lack of respect for them and his wife. But his anger was not merely human tantrum, it was a conduit for something divine. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, fueling his rage with supernatural power. He had a debt to pay, and he would not pay it from his own pocket. He stormed out of the banquet hall, leaving the wedding guests in stunned silence. Samson traveled 20 miles down to the coastal city of Ashkelon. He walked into the city like a storm. He found 30 Philistine men, perhaps soldiers or wealthy merchants, and struck them down. The narrative does not describe a battle, it describes an execution. He overpowered them with terrifying ease, stripped their bodies of their fine linen garments and changes of clothing, and gathered the spoils of war. He returned to Timnah, his clothes likely stained with the dust and violence of the road. He threw the garments at the feet of the 30 companions. He had paid his debt, but the price had been 30 lives. His honor was technically satisfied, but his heart was burning with betrayal. He did not even look at his wife. He turned his back on the marriage, on the feast, and on the city of Timnah. He marched back up the hills to his father's house, leaving his wife behind. In his absence, the Philistines, assuming he had abandoned her forever, gave her to his best man, one of the companions who had helped betray him. Months passed, and the anger in Samson's heart began to cool. It was the time of the wheat harvest, a season of abundance and golden fields. Samson, perhaps feeling a pang of regret or simply desire, decided to visit his wife. He brought a young goat as a peace offering, intending to reconcile and enter her chamber. He arrived at her father's house, expecting to be welcomed back as a husband who had forgiven the past. But when he tried to enter her room, her father stood in the doorway, blocking his path. The older man looked nervous and apologetic. "I truly thought you hated her completely," the father said, trying to explain the unexplainable. "So I gave her to your companion." Samson stood frozen. The woman he had chosen, the woman for whom he had killed 30 men, was now the wife of another man. The father, seeing the rising fury in Samson's eyes, quickly offered a solution. "Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please, take her instead." To Samson, this was not an offer, it was the ultimate insult. They treated him like a fool, trading women like livestock, disregarding the sanctity of his marriage and his honor. The ice in his heart turned into a cold, calculated fire. He looked at the father and spoke words that sounded like a formal declaration of war. "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." He was declaring that his next act was not a crime, but justified retribution. Samson did not draw a sword. He devised a plan that was as chaotic as it was brilliant. He devised a plan to strike at their resources. Using fire, he set the standing grain of the Philistines ablaze, spreading the flames through the fields. It was a feat that would have taken ordinary men weeks, but Samson gathered them quickly. He took the terrified, snarling beasts and tied them tail to tail in pairs. Between each pair of tails, he fastened a burning torch. He released the 150 pairs of foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. The animals, panicked by the fire chasing them, ran frantically through the fields. They did not run in a straight line. They scattered in every direction, spreading the fire like a living web of destruction. The timing was devastating. It was the harvest season. The grain was dry and ready for collection. The fire consumed the shocks of gathered wheat and the standing grain that was still in the soil. It spread to the vineyards and the olive groves. In one night, the agricultural wealth of the region was reduced to ash. The Philistines watched from their city walls as their food supply, their economy, and their livelihood vanished in a sea of orange flames. Samson had not just attacked an army, he had attacked the stomach of the nation. He stood on a distant hill, watching the smoke rise, a dark signal to the Philistines that the judge of Israel had declared total war. The smoke from the burning fields of the Philistines had barely cleared when the consequences of Samson's revenge took a dark and tragic turn. The Philistine lords, humiliated by the loss of their harvest and the destruction of their economy, looked for someone to blame. They did not dare to march directly against Samson yet, for his power was a mystery they feared. Instead, they turned their cruelty toward the ones closest to him. In a brutal act of retaliation, the Philistines went to the house of the Timnite. They took the woman who had been Samson's wife, along with her father, and ended their lives in a ruthless act of retaliation. The very fate she had tried to avoid by betraying Samson's riddle had now found her because of the conflict she helped ignite. The news of this atrocity reached Samson, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. The woman was gone, destroyed by the very people she had tried to appease. Samson's grief transformed instantly into a cold, terrifying resolve. He stood before the messengers who brought the news and swore a solemn oath. "Since you have done this," he declared, "I will surely take revenge on you, and only after that will I cease." This was no longer a personal feud or a family dispute. It was a campaign of justice. Samson descended upon the Philistines with a fury that had never been seen in the land. The text describes a great slaughter, but it was not a battle of armies. It was one man, fueled by the Spirit of God and the fire of grief, striking down the oppressors. He moved through their ranks with unstoppable force, defeating them completely in a legendary victory. After the conflict, exhausted and seeking solitude, Samson withdrew from the world. He went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam, a natural fortress where he could be alone with his sorrow and his God. The Philistines were not merely angry, they were terrified and mobilized for war. They marched their army up into the territory of Judah and spread out in the valley of Lehi. The men of Judah, seeing the enemy encampment, were filled with fear. They asked the Philistine commanders, "Why have you come up against us?" The answer was simple and chilling. "We have come up to arrest Samson," the Philistines replied, "to do to him as he has done to us." The men of Judah faced a choice. They could rise up behind their deliverer and fight for their freedom, or they could submit to their oppressors to save their own lives. Tragically, years of servitude had broken their spirit. They chose survival over liberty. 3,000 men from the tribe of Judah marched down to the cleft of the rock of Etam. They did not go to join Samson in battle, they went to capture him. When they found him sitting in the mouth of the cave, they spoke to him with accusation rather than gratitude. "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us?" they asked. "What is this that you have done to us?" To them, Samson was not a hero but a liability who disturbed the peace of their slavery. Samson looked at his own brothers, the very people he was born to save. He saw their fear and understood their betrayal. He did not fight them. He answered simply, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." The men of Judah stated their mission clearly. "We have come down to bind you and deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." Samson, knowing that he could destroy these 3,000 men if he wished, made a choice of mercy. He would not shed the blood of his own people. He made them swear one oath. "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves," he requested. They agreed. They said, "No, we will only bind you securely and deliver you into their hand. We will surely not harm you." They took 2 new ropes, strong and never used, and bound his hands and arms. Then they led him away from the safety of the rock, marching him toward the waiting enemy. The procession reached Lehi, where the Philistine army waited. When the Philistines saw Samson approaching, bound and helpless, surrounded by his own treacherous countrymen, they erupted in a shout of triumph. They believed the war was over. The ghost who haunted their fields was finally in their grasp. They rushed toward him, eager to tear him apart. But at that precise moment, the sound of their shouting triggered something within the prisoner. The Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon Samson. The power was sudden and explosive. The new ropes that bound his arms, which were strong enough to hold a bull, became like flax that has been burned with fire. They melted from his hands, the bonds loosening and falling to the dust as if they were made of ash. Samson stood free, but he was unarmed. He was surrounded by 1,000 soldiers with iron swords and spears. He scanned the ground for a weapon, any weapon. His eyes fell upon the skeletal remains of a donkey that had recently died. He reached down and seized the jawbone. It was not a sword, but in his hands, it became an instrument of divine wrath. He turned to face the charging line. What followed was not a duel, but a whirlwind. Samson moved with a speed and power that defied human limitation. He struck down opponent after opponent. The jawbone became an instrument of victory, overcoming every defense. He fought with the rhythm of a thresher in a wheat field. The Philistines, confident a moment ago, now found themselves facing a force of nature. Panic set in, but there was nowhere to run. One by one, they fell before him. The battle raged for hours. Dust choked the air. The sun beat down on the carnage. When silence finally returned to the valley of Lehi, 1,000 men lay fallen. Samson stood alone amidst the fallen, the jawbone still gripped in his hand. He composed a short poem of victory, his voice raspy but triumphant. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have defeated 1,000 men. The adrenaline of the battle faded, replaced by a crushing physical reality. Samson had just performed a feat of endurance that no human should be capable of. His body was pushed beyond the brink. He was dehydrated, his throat parched as dry as the desert sand. The victor of Lehi, who had just defeated an army, was now in danger of dying from simple thirst. He collapsed to the ground, his strength gone. For the first time in the story, we hear him cry out to God in vulnerability. He did not boast of his strength. He pleaded for his life. You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, he prayed. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. It was a humble prayer. He acknowledged that the victory was God's doing, not his own. He realized that without God, he was just a man who needed water to survive. God heard the cry of his exhausted judge. Suddenly God split the hollow place that is in Lehi. The dry earth cracked open, and cool, fresh water began to gush out from the stone. Samson dragged himself to the spring and drank. As the water touched his lips, his spirit returned, and he revived. He named that place En-Hakkore, which means the spring of the one who called. It remained a landmark for generations, a reminder that God not only empowers his servants for battle but also sustains them in their weakness. After the victory at Lehi, the dynamic of the land changed. The Philistines did not leave, but they stopped hunting Samson. They feared him too much. Samson officially assumed the role of judge over Israel. For 20 years, he led his people. However, the narrative implies a strange and lonely rule. Unlike other judges who rallied tribes and led armies, Samson worked alone. There is no mention of him training soldiers or uniting the clans of Israel. He was a solitary figure, a guardian who walked the borderlands. The Philistines stayed in their cities, and the Israelites stayed in their villages, and Samson stood between them as a deterrent. These 20 years were likely the most dangerous for his soul. The pressure of immediate war was gone. He became comfortable in his power. He began to believe that the Spirit of God was a permanent possession, a tool he could summon at will regardless of how he lived. The Nazirite vow remained outwardly intact. His hair grew long and braided, a crown of strength. But inwardly, the discipline was eroding. He had tasted the honey from the carcass. He had married a Philistine. He had touched the dead in battle. He was drifting further from the holiness of his calling, yet the strength remained. This false sense of security lulled him into a spiritual sleep that would eventually cost him everything. Toward the end of his judgeship, the restlessness returned. Samson, now an older man but still possessing his terrifying strength, traveled down to Gaza. Gaza was not just a city, it was the capital of the Philistine Confederation, a fortress of walls and soldiers. To go there alone was an act of supreme arrogance. He did not go for war, he went to satisfy his flesh. He entered the house of a woman in the city. It was a reckless decision. walking into the heart of enemy territory to indulge in sin. The presence of Samson in Gaza could not be hidden. The word spread through the streets like wildfire. Samson has come here. The Gazites were ecstatic. They believed their enemy had made a fatal mistake. They surrounded the house and set an ambush at the city gate. They whispered to one another, "Let us wait until the light of the morning, then we will end him." They locked the massive city doors and barred them with iron, trapping him inside. They were certain that at dawn, the legend of Samson would end. But Samson did not wait for the sun. He arose at midnight, perhaps sensing the danger or simply finished with his business. He walked through the dark streets to the main gate of the city. He found it locked and barred, a barrier designed to stop armies. Samson did not look for a key, and he did not climb the wall. He gripped the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts. With a guttural roar of effort, he pulled. The wood groaned and cracked. The stone foundations shifted. With a heave of supernatural power, he pulled the entire gate assembly, bar and all, out of the ground. He did not leave it there. He hoisted the massive structure, weighing thousands of pounds, onto his shoulders. He carried it, not just a few feet, but miles away, up to the top of a hill that faces Hebron. He planted it there as a trophy. It was a message of total dominance. He had left the capital city of his enemies defenseless, their gates ripped away like a toy. It was a humiliation for the Philistines, proving that their walls could not hold him. But beneath the display of power, the cracks in the foundation were widening. Samson was using the gift of God to protect his own sinful lifestyle. He believed he was invincible, unaware that the final and most dangerous trap was about to be set in the valley of Sorek. After the humiliation of the gates of Gaza, one might have thought Samson would finally learn the danger of walking into the darkness. But the heart of a man is often the last fortress to yield. Samson traveled to the valley of Sorek, a place where the rolling hills softened into fertile plains. There he met a woman named Delilah. Unlike his previous encounters, this was not merely a fleeting desire or a political arrangement. The scriptures tell us simply that he loved her. For the first time, the invincible warrior offered his heart to a woman, exposing the only vulnerability that iron and stone could not protect. But the Philistine rulers, always watching from the shadows, saw an opportunity that armies could not provide. The 5 lords of the Philistines came to Delilah with a proposition that weighed heavy with greed. They did not threaten her with fire as they had done to the wife at Timnah. They offered her silver. Each lord promised to give her 1,100 pieces of silver. It was a staggering fortune, enough to live like a queen for a lifetime. The task they set before her was specific. They did not ask her to kill him, for they knew she could not. They asked her to entice him and see where his great strength lay, and by what means they might overpower him to humble him. Delilah accepted the silver. She looked at the man who loved her and saw only a path to riches. The valley of Sorek, which means the vine, would become the place where the chosen Nazirite would be pressed and crushed. The game of betrayal began with soft words in the quiet of the night. Delilah, masking her intent with curiosity, asked Samson to reveal the source of his power. "Please tell me," she whispered, "where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you." Samson, perhaps sensing the danger or simply enjoying the cat-and-mouse game, decided to mock her with a lie. He told her that if they bound him with 7 fresh bowstrings that had not yet been dried, he would become weak and be like any other man. Delilah relayed this to the lords, who brought her the 7 green gut-strings. While Samson slept, she bound him. She had men lying in wait in the inner chamber, hidden in the shadows. When the trap was set, she shouted, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." He awoke instantly. He did not struggle. He simply flexed his muscles. The bowstring snapped apart like a thread of tow when it touches the fire. The ambushers remained hidden, terrified by the display. The secret of his strength remained unknown. Delilah, feigning hurt and indignation, scolded him. "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies," she complained. She pressed him again. This time, Samson invented a new fabrication. He told her that if he were bound securely with new ropes that had never been used for work, he would lose his power. Once again, she waited until he slept. She took new, thick ropes and tied him fast. Once again, she cried out the warning. And once again, Samson broke the ropes from his arms as if they were mere sewing thread. The third attempt was more intimate. Delilah wove the narrative closer to the truth. touching upon his hair but stopping short of the reality. Samson told her that if she wove the 7 locks of his head into the web of the loom and fastened it with a pin, he would be helpless. Delilah lulled him to sleep. With the patience of a spider, she took the long, heavy braids of the Nazarite and wove them tightly into the fabric on her loom, driving the pin deep to secure them. When she shouted the alarm, Samson woke up from his deep slumber. He did not patiently untangle himself. He stood up and pulled the pin of the loom and the web completely out of the frame, carrying the machinery with him. He was still invincible, but he was playing too close to the fire. 3 times Samson had lied, and 3 times he had escaped. But Delilah changed her tactics. She realized that ropes and looms were useless against his body, so she attacked his mind. She weaponized his love for her against him. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when your heart is not with me?" she asked, her voice filled with calculated sorrow. "You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies." She did not ask him once or twice. The narrative tells us that she spoke to him daily with her words and pressed him. It was a relentless emotional siege. She created an atmosphere of misery, making him feel that his silence was a lack of love. Samson, the man who could withstand the charge of an army, could not withstand the sorrow of a woman. His soul was vexed unto death. He was exhausted, isolated, and desperate for peace. Finally, the dam broke. He told her all his heart. He explained the Nazarite vow that had been placed upon him before he was born. He spoke of the razor that had never touched his head. "If I am shaven," he confessed, "then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." It was not the hair itself that held the magic. It was the hair as the symbol of his dedication to God. By revealing this to the enemy, he was offering up his covenant on the altar of his lust. Delilah listened, and this time she knew he had spoken the truth. She sent word to the lords of the Philistines, saying, "Come up this once, for he has shown me all his heart." The final scene in the valley of Sorek is one of tragic stillness. The lords of the Philistines came, bringing the silver in their hands. Delilah made Samson sleep upon her knees. It was a sleep of false security, the sleep of a man who had stopped fighting his conscience. She called for a man, a barber who moved silently in the dim light. The razor gleamed. One by one, the 7 locks of his head were shaved off. The thick braids that had grown for 20 years, the visible sign of God's promise, fell silently to the floor. As the last lock fell, his strength left him. It was not a violent exit, but a quiet departure. The Spirit of the Lord, which had empowered him for so long, withdrew. Delilah began to torment him, shaking him awake with the familiar cry, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. He tried to summon the power that had always been there, but his limbs were heavy and human. The surging energy was gone. The Philistines did not hesitate. They seized him before he could understand his loss. The capture was brutal. They held him down, no longer afraid of the giant. To ensure he would never lead Israel again, they plunged him into darkness. They bound him with fetters of bronze, heavy chains that finally held him fast. They dragged him down to Gaza, the very city where he had once ripped the gates from the walls. But he did not return as a conqueror. He returned as a trophy. They threw him into the prison house, where the champion of Israel was forced to grind at the mill. He pushed the heavy stone in circles, walking in the darkness, doing the work of a beast of burden. The breaker of chains had become a slave, and the judge of Israel was now a prisoner of the uncircumcised. But in the silence of the prison, unseen by his captors, the hair of his head began to grow again. The prison house in Gaza was a place of shadows and despair. Samson, the man who had once walked in the sunlight as a prince of Israel, was now reduced to the station of a beast. Day after day, he was chained to the heavy millstone. He walked in endless circles, grinding the grain for the very enemies he had sworn to destroy. The bronze shackles bit into his skin, a constant reminder of his failure. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the spiritual agony. In the darkness of his blindness, Samson was forced to look inward. For 20 years, he had relied on his muscles, his wit, and his privilege. He had treated the sacred calling of the Nazarite as a burden rather than a blessing. Now, stripped of everything, he began to understand the truth. His strength had never been his own. It was a borrowed gift, fueled by the Spirit of God, and he had squandered it. In the quiet rhythm of the grinding wheel, a transformation took place. It was not a transformation of the body, but of the soul. Samson began to pray, not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the humility of a broken man. And while the Philistines mocked him and the guards spat upon him, they failed to notice a small but terrifying detail. The hair of his head, the symbol of his covenant, began to grow again. The razor had taken his strength, but it could not take his destiny. As the locks lengthened, so did his faith return, growing silently in the dark. The lords of the Philistines decided that it was time to celebrate their total victory. They organized a massive religious festival to honor their god, Dagon. Dagon was the father of Baal, a deity often depicted as half man and half fish, representing grain and fertility. The Philistines believed that it was Dagon who had delivered the enemy into their hands, not knowing that it was the God of Israel who had orchestrated the entire timeline. The Temple of Dagon was a marvel of ancient engineering, a colossal structure designed to hold thousands of worshippers. On the day of the festival, the city of Gaza was alive with the sound of drums and trumpets. The sacrificial fires burned high, and the wine flowed freely. The 5 lords of the Philistines sat in the places of honor, surrounded by captains, priests, and the nobility of the nation. The roof of the temple was flat and spacious, and on this day, it was packed to capacity. 3,000 men and women stood on the roof, looking down into the courtyard below. They chanted praises to their idol, shouting, "Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our country, who killed many of us." As the hearts of the people became merry with wine and pride, a cruel idea spread through the crowd. They wanted to see the monster they had captured. They shouted to the guards, "Call for Samson, that he may perform for us." The order was given. Samson was hauled up from the dungeon. He was brought into the great hall of the temple, blinking his sightless eyes against the noise he could hear but not see. He was led by a young boy, a servant who held him by the hand. The crowd erupted in laughter and mockery. They threw food at him and jeered at his helplessness. The hero of Dan, who had once terrified armies, was now made to stand between the pillars like a circus animal. Samson stood in the center of the temple, the noise of 3,000 voices crashing over him like waves. He could feel the vibration of the celebration in the floor beneath his bare feet. He was weak, tired, and humiliated. Yet his mind was sharp. He remembered the architecture of the Philistine temples. He knew that the entire weight of the massive roof, with its thousands of spectators, rested upon 2 central pillars. He leaned down and whispered to the boy who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." The boy, thinking nothing of the request, guided the blind man to the center of the structure. Samson felt the cold stone of the southern pillar with his left hand and the northern pillar with his right hand. He was literally holding up the house of his enemies. At this moment, Samson did not ask for a weapon. He did not ask for a shield. He turned his heart toward heaven for one final conversation. He knew that he would not survive what he was about to do. This was not a suicide of despair. It was a military sacrifice, a final strike against the darkness that oppressed his people. He lifted his face toward the ceiling he could not see and cried out, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It was a raw, honest prayer. He acknowledged that the power belonged to God alone. He asked for just one moment of the old strength, not to save his life, but to give it away for a purpose. God answered the prayer. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson one last time, surging through his tired muscles with a force greater than he had ever known. Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested. He braced himself, his feet digging into the stone floor. "Let my fate be tied with the Philistines," he shouted, his voice thundering over the noise of the crowd. He bowed himself with all his might. The muscles in his back and arms corded like iron. For a split second, the pillars held. Then, a terrible cracking sound echoed through the hall, louder than the drums. The stone gave way. The pillars shifted and crumbled under the supernatural pressure. The reaction was instantaneous. The laughter of the crowd turned to screams of terror. The roof, unsupported and laden with the weight of 3,000 people, collapsed inward. The massive stones of the temple walls imploded. The structure came crashing down with the violence of an earthquake. Dust billowed up, choking the sky over Gaza. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. In one singular moment, the entire leadership of the Philistine nation was wiped out. The 5 lords, the generals, the priests, and the wealthy elite were buried beneath the rubble. The narrator of the scripture records a chilling statistic. Those he defeated in his final moment were more than those he had defeated in his life. The mission given to his mother by the angel was fulfilled. He had begun to deliver Israel. When the dust finally settled and the news reached the hill country, the brothers of Samson and all the house of his father came down to Gaza. The Philistines, leaderless and broken, did not stop them. The family retrieved the body of their fallen judge from the ruins. They carried him back up the long road to the land of Israel. They buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the tomb of Manoah his father. It was the same place where the Spirit had first begun to move him as a young man. The circle was complete. He had judged Israel for 20 years. The story of Samson is a tragedy, but it is also a story of hope. It reminds us that even the strongest men are fragile without God. It teaches us that talent and calling are not enough. Character and obedience must sustain them. But most importantly, it reveals the mercy of the Creator. God did not abandon Samson in his blindness. He heard the prayer of a broken man in a pagan temple. Samson stands as a mirror to us all. We see our own struggles in his flaws and our own hope in his redemption. His death was a picture of a greater victory to come, a shadow of another deliverer who would one day stretch out his arms and, through his own sacrifice, destroy the power of darkness forever. The breaker of chains had found his rest, and through his fall, his people were finally able to rise. The story of Samson is one of the most fascinating and tragic accounts in ancient history because it presents a profound paradox. We see a man who was physically invincible, yet emotionally fragile. He could tear a lion apart with his bare hands and lift heavy city gates, yet he was utterly defenseless against his own desires. This contrast teaches us a vital lesson about the nature of true strength. It reminds us that external power, talent, or success means nothing if we do not possess internal discipline. Samson conquered armies, but he could not conquer his own heart, and that was his ultimate undoing. One of the most striking aspects of Samson's life is how his fall was not sudden, but gradual. It did not begin in the valley of Sorek with Delilah. It began much earlier. It started when he walked into the vineyard he was supposed to avoid. It continued when he touched the dead lion and ate the honey, violating his sacred vow in secret. It escalated when he visited the city of his enemies to satisfy a fleeting lust. Samson believed that because he was chosen, he was above the rules. He thought he could play with fire without getting burned. This serves as a powerful warning to us. We often think that small compromises do not matter, but little by little, they erode our character until we find ourselves bound and blinded, wondering how we got there. However, the most beautiful part of this narrative is found in the darkness of the prison cell. It was only when Samson lost his sight that he finally began to see clearly. When he was stripped of his strength, his pride, and his freedom, he was forced to look up. The grinding wheel became his place of repentance. The scripture offers a subtle ray of hope when it notes that the hair of his head began to grow again. This symbolizes that failure is not final. God did not abandon Samson in the pit of his humiliation. It teaches us that sometimes we must lose everything we rely on to discover that our true foundation is faith. If you are listening to this story and you feel like you have made too many mistakes or that you have strayed too far from your purpose, let the life of Samson encourage you. You may feel like you are in the dark, grinding at the mill of regret. You may feel that your strength is gone, but the story ends with redemption. Samson accomplished more in his final moment of surrender than he did in a lifetime of self-centered striving. Do not rely solely on your own gifts or your own understanding. True victory comes when we surrender our weakness to a higher power. No matter how far you have fallen, it is never too late to call out. Just as Samson's hair grew back, your hope can return. Your past does not define your future, and your greatest victory may still be ahead of you. If you enjoyed this story, please support the channel by clicking the like button and subscribing for more biblical journeys. I would love to read your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below. Remember that no shadow is deep enough to hide you from the light. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.